again guys, welcome back to the channel. In today's video we are going to be taking a look at the most recent release for Microsoft Flight Simulator, and that is of course Asobo's second famous flyer for the sim, the Gee Bee Z and R2. Although the aircraft is part of Asobo's famous flyer series, once again as with the Staggerwing, it's actually been created by Carenado. So again, it looks as though Asobo have acquired one of Carenado's products and chosen to market it as their own. Overall, the Staggerwing was a pretty nice offering previously, and we know that Carenado do an excellent job when it comes to the visuals of the aircraft. The Gee Bee, as you can see for yourselves, is a pretty quirky airframe. It was designed for racing in the 1930s. So the aircraft is really built to go fast and not a whole lot else. I think with the particularly unusual airframe, it's going to be quite interesting to see how the aircraft actually handles in the sim. For our review today, we're going to be doing a spot of tail chasing out of Blue Marble Canyon. The package does come with both the Z and the R2 variant of the aircraft. We're going to be flying the Z variant, and our wingman on the right will be taking the R2. We'll carry out a startup, we'll head out off runway 21, we'll join up with the R2, make a run around the canyon, as I say, do a spot of tail chasing along the way. Once we've finished up, we'll carry out a stall just to demonstrate that, and then we'll make our way home back towards Blue Marble, we'll carry out the landing and a shutdown, and then as usual I'll finish up the review with my overall thoughts and opinions on the product. As always guys, I do hope you enjoy the video. If you do, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. If you have any comments or questions for me, you can leave those down in the comment section below. Let's now head for the cockpit of the Gee Bee Z and we'll get things underway. So welcome to the cockpit of the Asobo famous flyers, or realistically the Carenado Gee Bee Z. The R2's just taken off departing for the canyon, so we'll get the aircraft started up, we'll go follow him out. Just before we do that, taking a quick look around the cockpit, and as usual, very nice effort from Carenado. As you'd imagine, everything is modelled and textured very well. Anyway, running through our before start checks, the pre-flight inspection has been completed. Parking brake is set, radios are off, master switch and the alternator switches are both off. For the start itself, the master switch can go on. We'll do the same there for the alternator. Magnetos will set to both. Slightly unusual there in terms of how the magneto selector works. Usually the lever there on the end is actually pointed in the opposite direction, but that may be true to life for the real world aircraft. Anyway, mags are set to both. Fuel selector is set on the main tank. Mixture can go to fully rich. Prop RPM lever is set to max RPM. Power lever is set to idle. We'll prime 3 times. And again, as usual with the Carenado aircraft, overall the sound of the add-on is pretty good. So there's 3 pumps on the primer. Prop area is clear. We're not going to give everyone a shout. There's no way of opening the canopy without removing it entirely. So we can hit the starter. Booster core's not actually modelled on the aircraft. And we have the engine roaring into life. Nice sounds overall. We'll come up to just below 1000 RPM, let the engine tick over. Oil pressures come up nicely, the oil temperature should continue to rise. Radio's on. And for the before takeoff checks, once again the park brake is set. We'll carry out our run up in our present position, there's nothing behind the aircraft. So the canopy is closed and secured. Flight controls will check. And pretty much impossible to see the rudder from our seating position, but the flight controls are full and free. Mixture is set to fully rich. Throttle will come fully back on the stick and will come up to 1500 RPM. Ordinarily, of course, we'd want to give the engine a little bit longer there to warm up, but just for the sake of brevity in the video today, carry out the run up now. So just feeding in that throttle slowly to come up through 1500 RPM. Pretty nice sounds from the aircraft overall, and again, sounds tend to be pretty strong on Carenado's Microsoft Flight Simulator lineup. So there's our 1500 RPM, we'll check the mags. Onto the right mag. And we've got a drop there of around 100 RPM. We're looking for a max of 150. Back to both. Back up to 1500 RPM. And checking the left mag. And save drop there. And back to both. So there's our 1500, the mags are checked. We'll just cycle the prop lever. And you can see there we do have a drop in RPM. We'll just run through that once more. And back up to 1500. Temperatures and pressures looking good. The oil temperatures come up nicely there now. Fuel boost pump can go on. And we'll come back to idle on the throttle. And looks like we're idling around 600 RPM. So coming back up on the throttle to 1000 RPM. So we are all set and ready to go. We're going to taxi our way out towards the runway, which is just off at our 3 o'clock. Okay, so we are all set and ready to go here on runway 21. And just before we depart, I think it's worth mentioning the BG is incredibly hard to control during the takeoff roll. The rudder is typically overly sensitive, and rudder input also seems to induce an awful lot of roll. So as you'll see, the aircraft pretty difficult to maintain directional control in. Anyway, we'll get rid of the park brake. I find that full left aileron is the best measure initially. And you'll see the aircraft picks up speed very quickly, even at low power settings. I found there during the taxi. Even back at idle power, we really had to ride the brakes to keep the speed down. Anyway, you can see the aircraft very twitchy on the rudder here as we come up to speed. Bit of shaking, rattling there. The aircraft does not handle very well at low speeds either, as you'd probably expect. So just trying to keep the nose down and build up speed here as we go. Still full power for the time being. Overall, not too bad of a takeoff there in the aircraft. But again, very difficult to control, very difficult to maintain directional control in particular. Okay, so we're just coming up on the start of the run, which is the bridge. We've got the R2 just passing overhead at our 1 o'clock. We'll come up on the power, we'll follow him down. So there's full power, building up some speed here as we come under the bridge. Looks like we're going to play catch up a little bit here. He's obviously got a bit more speed on us. So keep full power for the time being. Quite a bit of buffeting there as we come underneath the bridge. I think that's one of the quirks of the Microsoft Flight Simulator atmospherics modelling. We've got the R2 just off the nose. He's peeling off to the left, so we'll follow him down through the canyon. Picking up quite a bit of speed now, up around 220 knots. And you can see the R2 just going up into the vertical there, going for an aileron roll. No need to follow him through on that for the time being. Looks like we're catching quite nicely now, so we'll just start to reduce our throttle, come back to around 30 inches on the manifold pressure. And continuing to catch here, so just reducing our speed slightly. We don't want to get too close here on our tail chasing buddy. He's going vertical again, going for another aileron roll, so we'll follow him through this time. And coming back down towards the ground. A little bit of a shame we don't have any smoke for the tail chase here, but of course the BG is built for speed, not for aerobatic display, so not entirely surprised we don't have any smoke. You can see though in the Z version of the aircraft the visibility is absolutely excellent. Not quite the same in the R2, the visibility is a little bit more restricted there. I'll show you that a little bit later on at the end of the video. Once again going into the vertical, following the R2 through in his manoeuvres. And the right aileron roll and track it back down towards the ground. Almost full power still here at the moment, just to catch up a little bit closer. And we'll come back on the throttle again now. We'll hold station more or less in our present distance. So continuing to track down the canyon, pinning off to the right. speed falling back to about 200 miles an hour. Overall the Gee Bee handles fairly nicely. It's a bit of a dog at low speed, as you'll see during the landing. To be expected though with those stubby wings. It's pretty easy to stall the aircraft anywhere up to around 140 knots if you put enough load on the wings, pull enough G. But once you've got some speed up, as you can see, reasonably manoeuvrable, although again you don't want to be pulling too much G in the aircraft, you will induce a stall. And it's a complete pig in the stall as well. Very easy to snatch a wing. We'll demonstrate that once we're out of the valley. So the R2 coming low level now as we come down through the valley. Once again we'll just come off the throttle, give him a bit of a chance to build a little bit of distance once again with us. And back up on the throttle again now as he's pulling away. So finishing up our run, he should peel off to the right, we'll peel off to the left. And we'll just clear the valley here, we'll gain a bit more altitude, and as I say, we'll just try a stall before we make our way home. Just going to lean out the mixture a little bit, keeping an eye on that EGT gauge. There's peak EGT, we'll come just rich of that. And ground level around 5,000 feet as we came out of the tops of the canyon there, so we'll climb up to around 8,000. The performance in the Gee Bee as well, pretty excellent. Obviously we've got that pretty sizable Junior Wasp engine up the front. You can see even doing around 150, 140 knots here, we're climbing at over 4,000 feet per minute rate of climb. Not sure whether or not that's historically accurate, but it is plausible. Again, the aircraft is a racer, so it does have an abundance of power. Now we'll just get ourselves up to 9,000 feet. Again, the BG is a bit of a handful at low speeds. So rather than going for a typical power on stall or power off stall here, we'll build up a bit of speed and we'll just induce a stall by pulling some G. Again, just to show you how the aircraft actually behaves in terms of high speed manoeuvrability. So about 160 miles there, coming back on the stick, you can see already getting a bit of buffeting there. Nice visual effects there on the canopy. But actually the aircraft now not wanting to go into spin. Almost snapping left wing low there. And ultimately putting in a little bit of aileron, we are almost snagging a wing. We'll just really try our best now to induce a spin. So fully back on the controls, we'll feed in some rudder there as well. And we got fully back on the elevator, full power. You can see the spin out to the right there. And just recovering before we reach the ground. So the flight model, fairly typical of a Carenado aircraft, nothing spectacular, but equally nothing egregious in the behaviour other than, I would say, the takeoff handling characteristics. Anyway, that's just about it for our flight. Let's head home back towards Blue Marble Airfield. Okay, so we're just making our way back down final approach for runway 03 this time. That does give us a slight tailwind, but it means we can taxi straight in towards the apron as opposed to having to backtrack. Once again, visibility over the nose of the BG pretty much non-existent, so really having to keep a good eye out for that runway, but it is down there, believe me. Just riding the edge of the stall, as you can see, a bit of buffeting there. Find around 100 knots is a pretty good approach speed in the aircraft. Just trying to keep an eye out for that runway. Just coming over the tarmac now, so holding the aircraft off, cutting the power. There's touchdown, gently coming back on the stick, coming straight onto the brakes here. The brakes in the BG are not particularly stellar, so riding those as we slow the aircraft down, and once again really having to dance on the rudders to keep the aircraft straight. Speed's coming back now, so all the way back on the stick, and just increasing the pressure there on the brakes to get the aircraft slowed down as we come off the runway. Okay, so just making our way back in towards the apron, once again having to zigzag our way down the taxiway here just to keep some sort of forward visibility. We'll hold the afterlanding checks till we're parked up. Obviously we'll focus on the taxi for the time being. And just gently coming onto the brakes, we'll swing the aircraft back out towards the east. And we're stationary, park brake can go on. Just leaving the throttle idling at 1000 RPM. We'll reset the elevator trim to neutral. Fuel boost pump can go off. And running through the shutdown checks, the park brake is set. Radio will leave for the time being. Mixture can come back to idle cutoff. And we do have a good rundown. Engine takes a pretty reasonable amount of time there to spool down. Mags can go off. And we'll get the alternator and the master switch off. So there you go guys, I hope you enjoyed our outing in the Asobo famous flyer Gee Bee Z. Once again, the aircraft has ultimately been developed by Carenado, and I would say that the product is very much up to their typical standards. So far I have been a little bit underwhelmed with some of Asobo's offerings via both the famous flyer and the local legend series. Generally speaking, the Carenado offerings have been a little bit above average, which is nice to see. And overall, as I mentioned many times now, I think that Carenado have been doing a pretty good job in Microsoft Flight Simulator to date. As a result of the product being marketed through Asobo, the aircraft is a little bit cheaper than most of Carenado's typical lineup. And once again, the product certainly has its issues, but overall I think it offers reasonable value for money. As usual, we'll briefly break things down into positives and negatives. I'll try and give you an overall conclusion as to what I think. Starting with the negatives, and once again it's fairly typical fare for a Carenado product, particularly one that has been released via Asobo. Firstly, documentation. I did have a pretty good look for that. I couldn't find anything. I have missed it a couple of times myself, but again, there are plenty of products that have been released without documentation, and I assume the BG is one of those. Not a major issue since the aircraft does come with in-sim checklists at the very least, so there is enough there to get you going. But you are rather left in the dark as to how to actually fly the Gee Bee, and it is a pretty tricky little beast to handle overall. One thing that I haven't liked about Carenado releasing their products via Asobo, it does tend to mean that we lose out on some of the features that we otherwise would have seen had the aircraft been released directly through Carenado. Once again, no onboard tablet, so no ability there to adjust any aircraft options, no external fixtures and fittings as we see on most native Carenado products. Perhaps not such a big deal with the Gee Bee, as obviously there probably wouldn't be too many external fixtures anyway, and you can see that we can remove the canopy on the Z variant, and similarly we can open the door on the R2. I felt that the default cockpit camera was rather too zoomed out. It definitely had that fisheye effect to it that more and more add-ons in the sim do seem to have. And similarly, I couldn't quite find a decent seating position such that I didn't get any clipping through the canopy at any point during the video. But to be fair to Carenado on that one, the canopy of the Gee Bee is pretty tight around the pilot, so it would be quite difficult really there to model that. My last and probably most significant negative for the product is once again the flight model during the takeoff. We know that that is a weakness of the sim at the best of times, but Carenado do seem to struggle more than most developers, I would say, when it comes to modelling tailwheel aircraft. The Gee Bee is almost uncontrollable during the takeoff, and I suspect the aircraft would be a bit of a handful in reality, but not quite to that degree. As I mentioned during the takeoff itself, the rudder input, again typically overly sensitive, as we see from many Microsoft Flight Simulator add-ons. But the rudder input also induced a lot of roll, so you really had to be quite proactive on the ailerons. And overall, during the takeoff, the aircraft really wants to depart from controlled flight, so it's quite tricky to get a decent takeoff out of the aircraft overall. That covers most of my major negatives. In terms of positives, again, they're all pretty typical positives for a Carenado offering. Visually, the aircraft once again very beautiful, both externally and internally. The level of attention to detail with both the modelling and the texturing, really good. The sounds I thought were really nice, both internally and externally. Carenado for the most part seemed to do very well with their sounds in the sim. I did like the fact that we had a more period-appropriate pilot avatar as well. I did think that we might lose that as a result of the aircraft being sold through Asobo, but it seems that Carenado chose to stick with that. The flight model was definitely a mixed bag. As I said, during the takeoff the aircraft didn't feel quite right to me, and perhaps a little bit the same during the landing as well. Once you're up to speed though, the aircraft actually flew pretty nicely. It felt the part more or less, quite a speedy, nimble little aircraft. And as I said, very quick to bite you at low speed or high G, which I imagine would be the case with those pretty stubby wings. The Junior Wasp engine also produced a ton of pull at full power, really wanting to drag that right wing down. So with the Gee Bee, you definitely get a sense of the fact you're flying a very powerful aircraft that really isn't designed for low speed flight, and as a result it makes the aircraft a really nice challenge to fly. Overall, that would probably be one of my main reasons to pick up the product if you were considering doing so. Firstly, as with many of Asobo's releases, it is quite a nice aircraft having the sim for the sake of historical interest. It's obviously quite an unusual, rather interesting airframe and design. And as I say, for me, although I'm not entirely sure how accurate the flight model is, I think it's worth picking up if you just want to challenge yourself a little bit in the sim. Certainly a real handful during the takeoff, tricky to land as well, so if you want to hone those flying skills, the Gee Bee is definitely a good option for that. It might be a little bit tricky to entirely recommend picking up the Gee Bee since it is a bit of a one-trick pony. Obviously the aircraft is built for speed. As you'll have seen during the video, the visibility over the nose is pretty much non-existent. So it's not really as if you can use the aircraft as a frequent flyer, it really is just going to be for a little bit of fun every now and again. And a little bit like we saw with Asobo's previous release, the Val, you're going to be a little bit limited in terms of what you can actually do with the aircraft in the sim. In terms of FPS, once again the aircraft was pretty frame rate friendly. That seems to be quite typical of Carenado offerings. I was getting about 103 FPS in the Gee Bee Z versus about 107 in the default Cessna 152. I didn't spend quite as much time in the R2 variant of the aircraft, but once again it is included in the package. And in a sense you're really getting 2 for 1, so quite good value for money with the product since the cockpit of the R2 entirely different from the Z variant. The R2 up to Carenado's usual standards internally, the cockpit very nicely modelled, a little bit more modern. And the cockpit door is operable, it does open and close, which is great as that's obviously a little bit of a step up above many of Asobo's offerings to date. Anyway guys, once again I do hope you enjoyed the video and our outing in the Gee Bee. It's an interesting little aircraft. I do think it offers reasonable value for money given that you get the 2 variants, and again it is something to have a little bit of fun in, if nothing else. If you enjoyed the video, please consider giving it a like. If you want to see more content from the channel, please consider subscribing as well. As ever, a very big thank you to my channel members and patrons for all of your support. It's hugely appreciated, and it's been really nice to see as well the number of people looking to support the channel steadily growing. As always guys, I hope you're having a great day wherever you are. Take really good care, and I will see you all again soon.